ahead and get things kicked off today. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their evening, afternoon, or morning, depending upon where you're at. We're excited to have everybody on board as we start to really talk about and get into succession planning. Obviously, the title today, How to Get Started with Succession Planning. Want to use this as an opportunity for people to learn more about the topic, give you a chance to ask questions, and see what kind of path it takes us down as you're getting this information. My name is Andy Crawford, and I'm located in Atlanta, Georgia. What you're seeing on your screen here, I don't know if anybody out there watches House of Cards, but Frank Underwood always has great quotes. And as I was looking through some things that about Kevin Spacey, I came across this interview he did. I think it was called with Levo Group was the name of it, the company that he did an interview with, and he was talking about really helping to drive things within not only our country but organizations. And his quote came out on there: if you're lucky enough to do well, it's your responsibility to send the elevator back down. And that really kind of it kind of struck a chord with me, you know, not only being a parent but also working in organizations where I've worked with people on trying to develop them. And I think it's one thing, as we'll talk about today in succession planning, it's one thing to kind of tap the people who we feel are ready, but I think part of it too is helping them reach their goal, helping them attain that, helping them obtain the knowledge and skills necessary to make that move for your company. Because ultimately, you know, I think a lot of companies out there confuse succession planning with replacement planning, and they're obviously two different things. And really today we're going to be talking about the need to look into the future. Unfortunately with succession planning, we're going to need to point out some of the gaps and holes in our employees that we need to help them fill. So this kind of, once again, Christy, I hope you don't mind me throwing that in there, but I just thought that was a really neat quote to really kind of all of us get our mind around helping our fellow employees out.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I appreciate the quote.
Yeah, so once again, my name is Andy Crawford. We're fortunate enough to have Dr. Christy Panico on the phone with us today. We've both been with Pensight for, I'm coming up on just 1 year. Christy been with Dr. Martin Lanik in Pensight for several years. And what are we at Pensight? We're, just so you know, we are a live assessment provider. Well, we provide leadership assessments, sales assessments that show the readiness of your employees, the readiness of your candidates to perform. And if there are holes and gaps, kind of as I spoke of earlier, we really work with you on how long it's going to take you to fill in those holes and gaps, but also the training they're going to need. So once again, thanks everybody. Christy, I'll let you introduce yourself there.
Great, thank you, Andy. As Andy mentioned, I'm the assessment manager here at Pensight, and I've been here a number of years. My background is in industrial organizational psychology. So part of my role at Pensight is helping oversee some of our internal talent management, as well as overseeing some of our partner relations and our partners' accounts, and then also some of the research and development initiatives that we're constantly striving to improve the simulations that we're offering and increase the amount of validation evidence that we have for those. So in terms of our agenda for, oh, sorry, go ahead, Andy. I'll let you
go. No, go ahead there. I was just going to jump in and say, yeah, today's agenda, obviously we're trying to start tackling a small portion of succession planning, but really today during there we're going to talk about the common succession risks and really how to mitigate them. We're going to look at which positions you really need to put a plan in place for succession planning, and really how to identify the successors for those critical positions. So once again, we want to make sure that we're giving you kind of the basis. And, you know, I guess this is blocking and tackling 101 that we can really get after and attack here today. So Christy, with that in mind, I'll go ahead and turn everything over to you.
Great, thank you, Andy. So I'd like to start with just a few steps, and given that you're on this webinar, my guess is you're probably familiar with some of these statistics. But the first one is as few as 29% of organizations have a succession plan in place. So this isn't something that's very common, yet other statistics suggest that a recent survey of top HR executives, 84% of those executives reported that they've lost a top manager or expert without a successor. And 24% of those say that this happens to them frequently. So succession management and succession planning in and of itself is inherently risky, but it's extremely risky when there's no plan in place. So when you're part of the 71% of organizations that don't have a succession plan in place, that's when we see the most risk inherent in the succession management process. So getting to a little bit more about the risk in succession management, we'll talk through briefly what are some of the risks that we commonly see, and then we'll spend the majority of this time really talking about how do we mitigate that and how do we set up steps for developing a succession management or succession planning program. But there are a lot of risks inherent in succession management, whether that be lost productivity, the cost associated with that, the cost associated with recruitment or hiring costs, employee morale. Certainly, it's never fun to be one of the employees in an organization when everyone else is leaving and there's all that anxiety about what's going to happen next. There's also public distrust, negative press, as I'm sure we've all read about recently in the news. But the upside to this is that there's also great reward for planning this and setting up effective succession management. So that's really what we'll focus on today, is how do we set up effective succession management programs. So as I mentioned, there's a few key risks associated or inherent in the succession management program. And as with any problem, I think it's helpful to be aware of what those risks are so that we can really make sure that we're addressing those and mitigating those inherent risks. So the majority of the webinar, again, will focus on how do we mitigate these risks. But I'd like to cover briefly what are the types of risks that we commonly encounter. So the first one is the transition risk. And this is the risk of an external candidate, of hiring an external candidate and then they fail. And so this risk is common for many companies. Oftentimes we're very concerned about this, and this is why we're more prone to hire internally. But there are situations when we need to look externally, and then we take on the risk of hiring someone that's unfamiliar with the organization or unfamiliar with the role, or maybe they're just not a great fit for us. And we assume that risk when we're hiring those external candidates. The next one is the readiness risk. So this is the risk of successors being unable to execute the key strategic priorities. So a lot of companies are asking who's ready, who's going to be ready to move into this next position. But very few are asking who's ready for executing strategy A or strategy B. And really being able to concretely define what are those strategies is one of the ways that we'll propose you can help mitigate this readiness risk of hiring successors that maybe are ready, generally speaking, but if they're not ready to execute our strategic priorities, that's really not going to do us a whole lot of good. And then the final risk here is the vacancy risk, and this is probably the most commonly recognized and feared succession planning risk. This is having the risk of not having a leader when you need one in a critical leadership position. So whether that's because one of our leaders leaves abruptly, has medical concerns or medical leave, decides to, or is not hitting the numbers that we need, and so we're kind of forced to ask them to leave. Whatever it may be, not having a leader when one is needed in a critical leadership position is probably the most commonly recognized and feared succession planning risk. And so we'll, of course, talk through ways that we can mitigate that in this process as well. So it may seem difficult to mitigate all these risks in succession planning, and of course there's no way that we can completely mitigate all risks. However, top-rated organizations have found ways to mitigate many of these risks, and that always involves having succession plans in place. So what we'll do is we'll talk through 5 steps to building a succession planning process that works and that's based on best practices. And inherent in this process, so these are foundational steps for setting up succession planning. These are also steps for mitigating the risk in that process as well.
Hey, Christy, quick question for you. I get this quite often as I'm talking to clients out there. It's kind of what comes first, the chicken or the egg type of question, but many of them they're putting development programs in place before they're doing, like, say, a talent assessment. Is there a right or wrong way to really think about this, and is this order the preferred and critical way of doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually one I hear fairly commonly as well. I would say it is pretty critical to do the assessment before the development, because otherwise with the development approach, you're going on what hunches of what you think people need are, or you're taking a one-size-fits-all approach, and we know that both of those don't tend to work very well. So by doing the assessment prior to the development, you're able to have a lot more objective information and concrete information to inform what that development should look like, thereby allowing you to really tailor it for the individuals that you have, make sure that you're meeting those needs, which will not only enhance their development and their growth, but of course it's going to engage them more if they're getting something that they actually need in that development process.
Perfect. Thank you.
So with that, let's move into the 5 steps of setting up the succession planning process and mitigating risk in that. And the first one is assessing organizational readiness. So succession management and succession planning is really bound to fail if your organization's not ready to embrace it or to support that. And there's a number of different factors that go into this. So the first one is executive buy-in. So this really starts with making sure that the executive team has at least expressed support. Ideally, we want them requesting this process, but at the very least we want to make sure that they've expressed support in the succession program. And one way to do this is really tying it to those business strategies. So making sure that we're demonstrating the business necessity of succession management can be one way to encourage executive buy-in, and then also incorporating them in the process. The more that someone's involved in the process, the more likely they are to buy into that process. The second is assessing the strategic priorities. So key to making sure that this is aligned with the strategic priorities and making sure that those have been identified and that everyone agrees on this. So this can be a way to get executive buy-in as well, is bring them all together and ask what are our strategic priorities, what is most important for us to be able to execute over the next 12 months. And then these strategic priorities should really be guiding the entire succession management process. So that's why it's really key that this is done in the first step of the process. The next part here is culture. So the organizational culture is going to dictate really how successful succession management and the development of employees is going to be. So it's important to do a pulse on the culture to make sure that leaders are comfortable discussing employee performance, they're comfortable giving feedback, and that those individuals that are going through developmental programs really have the support that they need, not just resource support, but also emotional support and training support for the areas that we're asking them to develop. Related to that is the human resource structure. So here, the most critical component is making sure that there's really someone or a team, one person or a team of people that are taking responsibility for the succession management program. So making sure that leaders are held accountable for assessing and developing others, and that there really is one main sponsor or a small team of sponsors that are driving this initiative forward. And oftentimes we see that comes through HR. Finally is the metrics, so making sure that there's goals for the program, that these goals have been identified, and that they're clearly defined so that we can determine are we meeting these goals or not. And then lastly is systems. So this is making sure there's systems in place to support communication, to support information sharing, and to support the tracking of the succession management process. So there's a lot of factors, there's a lot going on in succession management, so making sure that there's really a system to organize that and track all of that is going to be key for setting up a successful program. So now we'll move to step 2, which is defining the critical roles. And the succession management or succession planning has traditionally, when we think of this, we think of CEOs and how do we groom our next CEO, how do we identify who that successor is going to be. But really there's a number of critical roles in the organization, and these are all inherently related. So it shouldn't be just those CEO leaders or the executive leaders that we're concerned with. Really all of our levels of leadership can have a big impact on our ability to meet future needs and plan appropriately for those. So with the executive team and senior leaders, these are the individuals responsible for vision and strategy, and oftentimes they're seen as most essential to include in succession planning. And I don't disagree with that, but I would say that we do have an over-reliance on the CEO transition planning, whereas the other leaders on that executive team, who will also be very missed if they decide to leave abruptly or if we need to fill their position in a pinch, we don't spend as much time developing those and thinking about succession management for those teams. So I would say all of the executive team is really considered a critical role and something that we should be considering. And then beyond that is the mid-level managers. So these are the individuals that are creating and implementing our systems and processes. And of course, these individuals can't be transitioned into executive level positions unless there's someone to fill their roles. So it's all inherently interlinked in the sense that for executive succession planning, we also have to be thinking about the mid-level leaders that are going to be taking into those spots, and then we're going to need to be filling those spots as well. And then finally, there's the team leaders or the managers. I would say this portion is often overlooked in succession management, but it's equally as key as some of these other components in the sense that, again, we're going to be able to need to move people up the ladder. But if we think about our frontline leaders and our team leaders and managers, really these are the individuals that have the most influence on our individual contributors. They're the ones interacting with them on a daily basis. And in a lot of cases, they're also the ones interacting the most with our clients or our customers. So it's just as critical that we have team leaders and managers that are well equipped to be in their leadership roles as it is to have mid-level leaders and executives in those roles as well. So the third step is conducting the talent assessment, and as Andy's question kind of got to previously in terms of why this comes before the development. Sometimes you've seen this reversed, and we really recommend assessing the talent prior to doing development so that you can find an approach and find the needs of your talent pool and really make sure you're pinpointing those in the development. And through effective talent assessment, you have the ability to do that. So with talent assessment, the important components here are making sure, one, it's linked to business strategies, that we're using reliable and valid methods, and that we're using multiple assessment components. So here on this slide, you'll see at Pinsight, we determine readiness as a measure of personality, so the individual's innate tendencies. We also specialize in the simulation assessment, so that's really the heart or the main component of how we do talent assessment, but that's integrated with this personality and then the learning agility component. So looking at an individual's propensity to grow and to continuously want to learn.
Hey, Christy, there are thousands of companies today that only use the personality behavioral test only. I mean, prior to coming on to work with Pinsight, that was the world that I resided in. So how are they doing it the wrong way, or how are these other components really kind of play into that as far as determining who's next?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so with talent assessment, like with anything, the more information we have, really the better decisions we're going to be able to make. So using personality is helpful. That gives us quite a bit of information about that individual's innate tendencies and their motivation. So we look at personality in terms of if someone's personality is more aligned with a particular skill or behavior, they're going to be more motivated to execute that skill or behavior. But that's just one piece of the component. We also need a way to really gauge what are their current skills. So by using simulation assessments, we're getting that information that you can't get in a personality inventory, that you can't get in a learning inventory, and that frankly you can't get in any multiple choice assessment. But really the only way to be able to see someone's skills in action is by putting them in a situation and really observing what are those skills at that moment. Did that answer your question, Andy?
Absolutely, thank you.
Great. So on that note, I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about the simulations. There was a recent HBR article just earlier this week on how companies are using simulations and really the rise in the use of simulations for making hiring decisions and promotion decisions, such as in succession management. And then beyond, underneath that, I've included a short research study that also came out just the other week that also shows that assessment centers, so assessment centers is really the technical term for simulations, but simulations is more commonly understood, so that's typically what we call them. But this research suggests that assessment centers are really on the rise. And the article speaks to the idea of what they call a corporate tryout, or the idea that we need to really be able to put our leaders in a situation where we can assess their skills, and in a low-risk situation, before we put them into that new position and see if they sink or swim, we need the ability to analyze that prior to making those decisions. And that's what a simulation offers. It offers that simulated work environment where we can look at how does a person react to coaching a subordinate? How do they react when they're asked to present a project plan to their boss? And so we're looking at those behaviors in real time, which provides a different look into understanding when someone's going to be ready, because it's really capturing behavioral information and really understanding that individual's current skills.
I always find this, when I first saw this study, I found it amazing that there aren't more companies who are, I guess, kind of test driving or making their senior leaders try out for the next position, whereas a lot of them are just tapped. And what I kind of found very interesting is I was just thinking back to when my daughter was 8 years old and we moved to a new city. She had to go try out for her new gymnastics club. You know, I thought I could just go in and write a check and say, hey, she's been doing gymnastics, she wants to do it more. No, they had to try out and see that she could do certain skills, perform in certain ways. So we're making kids try out for sports teams, but companies don't necessarily make their leaders try out. So I found that interesting once I saw this study.
Yeah, absolutely. And the study, or the HBR article, speaks to that a little bit more as well in terms of kind of the inconsistency of our logic. Like you said, making kids try out for band or sports, but not making leaders try out to run a company, something that arguably has a much more substantial impact on others. So here at Pennsite, we do specialize in simulation assessments, and so that understanding of the individual's current skills is a key part of this, but that's not the only part. So as I mentioned before, it's critical to use multiple pieces of information, and the more information that you can use to make those decisions, ultimately the better that decision is going to be. So we measure potential or readiness in terms of current skills, the motivation and the personality component. We also look at learning agility, and then finally we consider the ease of development. So if we have one employee that has a development gap for something that's considered relatively easy to develop, and we have another employee with the development gap of something that's considered difficult, that's important for us to know. Yes, they both have one skill gap, but it's going to take the individual with that harder skill gap much more time. So that's an important part of this equation. And then another part of that is directly linking it to those business strategies. So when we're looking at an individual's current skills or their motivation or current skills for what? To build new products or services, or to focus on core business. It's important to define that strategy concretely, which allows us to create those talent pools of who's ready now, who could be ready in 6 months, maybe who's not ready at this time, to provide that more targeted developmental effort. So what you're looking at now is one of the sample reports from Pennsite, and the reason I present this is because it's just one way to look at how talent analytics and talent assessment can inform succession planning decisions. So what you're looking at is one of our group reports. It's a 9-box grid, and what we've actually done is plotted performance versus potential. It's a pre-populated 9-box grid, and the beauty of this is that it's based on objective data of really understanding what is that individual's current skill set. So through observing them in the simulation itself, we're able to assess what is their current performance. We're able to assess potential through some of those other assessment inventories that I mentioned. And then we're able to automatically plot a 9-box grid to show really what is the performance and potential of this particular group. And then at the top you'll see that there's business strategies. So the business strategies are really defining performance and potential. And if I selected different business strategies, for example, I would see the graph change. So again, it's always coming back to being concretely tied to those business strategies. And then as we move towards the next step, which is developing talent, I also wanted to highlight this feature of our simulation assessment, which is a customized needs analysis. And this really gets to the question Andy asked at the beginning in terms of, do you assess talent first or do you develop them first? And really we're arguing you need to be able to assess them first so that you get information such as this, wherein you're able to see for this particular group of 5 individuals, what are their training needs? How many individuals have a particular training need for speaking with charisma or taking strategic priorities? And additionally, what is the ease of development for those skills? So this really helps us maximize the ROI. If I only had 3 months with my leaders, I would know that I could focus on some of these easier developed skills that more of my leaders have a training need for, and thereby ensuring that I'm going to see a greater return on that development investment. Now we're at the 4th step, which is actually developing the talent. And of course, there's a number of ways to develop talent, but the reality is if we fail to develop our talent, we're going to find ourselves in need of a successor with no candidates. And this is a bad situation to be in, because then we're forced to choose between 2 poor candidates or really funneling more time and money into hiring that outside talent. So there's, of course, a number of ways to develop talent. Here's a couple of how-to best practices for developing talent, tying to business strategies, attaining that buy-in. The praxis and accountability is key. So we know that one of the issues with developing talent traditionally has been what's called a lack of training transfer. So someone learns a new skill, but then they don't actually apply it on their job. So by building in that practice as well as the accountability on the job, that can be a really helpful way to develop talent and to develop our next successors. And then, of course, we want it to be difficult yet attainable, something that people are going to strive for, but something that's realistic for them. And there's a focus on strengths and gaps. I know there's a lot of talk in the field about a strengths-only approach, and while I inherently like that idea, it's not a complete picture. We do need to be able to focus on those gaps. So at Pinsight, we focus on what we call the quick fixes. So there's skill gaps, but there's still somewhat strengths in the sense that they're their quickest opportunity to improve. They have that baseline level of skill, and they just really need to polish that. And that can be, again, a great way to increase the ROI of that talent investment. And then the final and the 5th step is the decision-making process. So actually going at the time when you need to make a decision point, there's some things that we want to be able to decrease and some things we really want to be able to increase at that point. So in terms of decreasing, first and foremost is the sole use of intuition. So there is really an implicit belief that intuition is the best way to predict talent management or the best way to predict behavior, and we have decades of research suggesting that that really isn't the case. That's why there is an entire science behind this, and so really relying on that science to help to be a decision aid in that process is something that will help improve the outcome of that process. We also want to decrease the use of bad data. So by bad data, I'm primarily referring to performance ratings, and there's a number of issues inherent in performance ratings that make them bad data. But the first and foremost is if we're trying to predict a successor for a future position, it doesn't help us to use past-looking data, so data from how they performed in the past. Depending on what their role was before, it may or may not even be applicable for the role that we're asking them to move into. So using forward-looking data is a great way to improve the quality of decision-making. Having a decision-making process in place. So making sure that this is defined from the get-go and that once it gets to the point of that decision time, that there's a process that you follow that's been outlined and agreed upon beforehand. And then, of course, we want to decrease the fact that no potentials are identified. And by having the succession process in place, will help address that issue. And then some of the things that we want to increase, and I've spoken to these throughout the webinar, so I'll touch on them briefly, is first and foremost the use of multiple pieces of data. So when making a decision, the more data we have, the better decisions we're going to be making. Directly linking that to the business strategies, so making sure that employee growth can always be clearly tied to those business strategies is not only going to help us ensure that we're addressing those strategies, but it's going to help our employees understand why it's important, why they should be investing time into these development that we're asking them, or into different developmental programs. If they see the business necessity of that, they're more likely to buy into that process. And then finally is getting all these decision makers involved. So this can be executives, this can be business group leaders, of course our HR partners, we want them to have a seat at the table here as well. So not only defining from the get-go who's going to be involved, but really making sure that everyone is involved in that process will help ensure that once it comes to that decision point, that we're able to make better decisions about the successors that we have. And so to recap, we went through 5 steps of getting started with succession planning. And not only are these steps that we can walk through to developing a succession management program, but these steps were created and presented because they also mitigate the risk that's inherent in this process. So this is really based on best practice in terms of how we can set up and manage our succession planning program. And that is all we have. Andy, have we had any questions come in?
Yeah, we've had quite a few here. I'll start with the first one. They want to know, how far out should you look to do succession planning? Are there any guidelines on the amount of time, length of time you should look forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, based on our experience, I would recommend at least looking 3 to 4 years in advance. So moving beyond just what's next month or what's next year, and really trying to have more of a forward-looking approach. Of course, you don't want to go too far, because then the rate of things changing and the rate of error making those predictions is going to increase. But I found 3 to 4 years is a happy medium in terms of making sure you're proactive, but not looking too far out.
Okay, thank you. The next question that came in, how do you use 360 feedback in conjunction with assessments, or can they be used together?
Certainly they can be used together. I know many organizations do that. I would argue that 360s really more have their place in developing talent rather than necessarily assessing talent. So in the context of a succession planning, I would see 360s falling into that 4th step of how do we develop talent. And I say that mainly because we know that there's a lot of inherent biases, or that 360s are prone to bias, and that they tend to be perceived as a fairly subjective approach to determining someone's potential or performance. And so the appeal of 360s, or really where I feel like they offer their most benefit, is in helping a leader understand how are they perceived by others. And of course that's inherent in the concept of 360s. So with that in mind, I would say that's a helpful conversation to have in the development process. But due to the subjectivity and the bias involved in it, I would say it probably shouldn't be part of the assessment process prior to that.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. Is succession planning going to stick around, or is it kind of the flavor of the month?
That is a good question. It certainly seems like it's a trend in the sense that we've seen a lot more attention and a lot more publicity around it. But I'd argue that it's not because it's the flavor of the month, but rather because we have a greater need for it. So as baby boomers are retiring, we are seeing a mass exodus of critical knowledge that's going to severely and negatively impact many of organizations. And I don't think we're going to see that change for a while. I honestly think we're going to see it get worse before it gets any better. So I don't think it's the flavor of the month. I think it'll be around for quite a while.
Okay, great. The next question, it says, based upon the 9 box you displayed, Just trying to make sure I understand this. It talks about, okay, one is showing that they're the most advanced, the other ones show that they still need development. How do you keep everybody engaged? So it says, and we're going to say again, you've got the one person who was displayed as being, ready, looked like it was almost a ready now. They were the furthest out in green. How do you keep them engaged if there's not positions available?
That's a really good question, and that's one of the important components of being able to identify what are your talent pools in terms of readiness. Because the development needs of someone that's ready now, of course, they're going to vary from those that are ready in 6 months versus those that are ready in 12 months. So I would say for the ready now individuals, the focus is exactly what this person suggested, which is engaging them. So keeping them motivated and keeping them challenged in the position they're in. And you could do that through increasing their visibility within the organization, maybe increasing their access to executives or clients, depending on what their role is. Also increasing their freedom and their autonomy in their role. We know that they have the skill set, they're currently performing at a high level, and they have high potential. So giving them the freedom to really use that can be a way to keep them engaged.
Okay. Fantastic, thank you. The next question in, how do you decide if you're going to promote internally versus bringing in external candidates?
That is a good question. So I would say there's a couple ways to determine that. First is looking at your internal candidates. If you don't have any internal candidates that are ready and you don't have anyone that's close to being ready to execute those strategic priorities, then that becomes a decision of how much do you want to invest in that development versus maybe that's the time to start looking externally. Traditionally, internal candidates are preferred. Most organizations prefer to promote from within, and there's certainly a number of benefits to doing that. But the research suggests that that's most beneficial when the organization is performing well, when the organization is experiencing high performance and high growth. And traditionally, the research suggests that external candidates can be more beneficial in situations where the organizations may be struggling a little bit more. Maybe they've had some negative events or negative publicity, and at those times it can be best to bring in a fresh face. So I would say it's both a understanding of the context, where the organization's at, what the situation is for them, but also looking at the candidates you have and how realistic is it to promote internally, and do you have the resources that will be needed to develop that talent internally?
Kind of just had a follow-up to that one pop up. They said, would you recommend giving the external candidate the same assessment as the internal and then comparing the results?
Absolutely. I would say for the purpose of standardization and consistency and objectivity and making sure that it's a fair process, internal candidates and external candidates really should be going through the same steps.
Okay, great. Next question. What type of training opportunities do you need to provide to ensure your current employees develop the skills they need?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a little general in the sense that in terms of the opportunities that you're going to need to provide, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach. There's not a single answer I can give to that question. The answer really depends on what are the training needs of those individuals. And so that's why we've really suggested in this webinar that it's important to be able to identify what those training needs are through an assessment process prior to development so that you can customize that development approach for employees.
And there was a follow-up on that one also. Would it be considered, they said, would it be considered fair to have individualized programs that might be different for each person? Would that be construed as maybe discriminating against somebody else? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think it's more than fair. I think it's our obligation to the employees to do that. So again, that one-size-fits-all is not going to work. By taking more of that individualized approach, we're able to really make sure we meet their needs. It reminds me of a conversation I had when I was a kid with my dad, because my brother would be allowed to do all these things, and I always said, you know, it's not fair. And my dad said, well, I'm not going to be fair. I'm going to treat you with what you need, and I'm going to treat him with what's best for him. So it's not always going to be fair. It's going to be really suited to what each of you need. And I think that same mentality applies with employees. And I know even as a young kid, when that was explained to me, I still didn't like that I couldn't do what my brother could do, but I certainly understand the rationale and I respected that.
Okay. Another one here that just came in. They're asking, is there a universal way to try to gain buy-in from the associates and management teams that you have seen work successfully?
I'm not sure that there's a universal way per se. I would say in terms of what might be universal is keeping people involved in that process. So research suggests that the more people are involved in the process, the more we ask their opinion, the more we ask them to participate in that, the more committed they're going to be to those outcomes. So I would say if there's any universal, it's really getting them involved, making sure they have a seat at the table from the beginning, and that we're asking for their input, and we're listening to that input and helping them be part of that process, or encouraging them to be part of that process the entire way. Beyond that, I would say it's also probably a factor of the organizational culture. So thinking about how do you influence leaders in your particular organization, it's going to look different from one organization to another depending on what that organizational culture is. So I'd say having that cultural sensitivity is another component that could perhaps be universal.
Okay, great. And I think we've got time for one more. And it's very simple. How do I keep the momentum going? I think you kind of tied back to that in your previous answer. I think it really is getting the buy-in from everybody involved. I think it's probably just as important to share the results, you know, with who's getting promoted and why. I'd also, you know, venture to say that if you've got very visible training and development programs and people can see their efforts being rewarded, I would think that would really help drive the continued you know, continued success, continued momentum of the program. Is that, can that be assumed that's kind of some of the things to do there, Christy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with everything you said. The only thing I'd add to that is, again, making sure it's tied to those business strategies. That's always going to be kind of at the forefront, or it should be at the forefront of our leaders' minds. So, and it helps, again, see that business necessity, which always brings it back to, you know, it's not just the flavor of the month. It's not just this program someone wants me to do. This is something we need to do to drive organizational growth and to be successful in my job. And I find when that relation or when that link to the business necessity is more clear, it's a lot easier to keep that momentum going.
Well, fantastic. Well, Christy, I see that we're out of time. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with me and everybody who's joined today.
Absolutely. Thank you for co-facilitating this, Andy. It's always a pleasure.
I had a great time. Everybody out there, just remember what Kevin Spacey said. If you have achieved success, you know, it's our responsibility to send that elevator back down. So let's help as many other people hit their goals as we can. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and look forward to catching up with everybody soon. Bye now.
Great. Thanks. Bye.